You are 19 years old, and the last thing your father ever built for you was a small kite made from bamboo and paper, no larger than your palm, its wings painted the pale blue of a clear morning sky. In a small fishing village along the coast of Kagoshima, your father, Izamu, spends his evenings mending nets by lamplight. And on the evenings he does not mend nets, he builds kites. Because he says your hands have always loved the sky more than they ever loved the sea. You were the boy who stood on the breakwater every afternoon after school, watching gulls ride the wind currents above the harbor. And it surprises no one in your family when, at 17, you volunteer for the Naval Air Service instead of following your father onto the fishing boats. Your mother, Sachiko, cries the morning you leave for training, though she tells you it is only the wind making her eyes water. Your younger sister, Emmy, presses the small bamboo kite into your bag before you board the train, insisting you will need something from home once you're finally flying for real. Flight training begins in 1943, and for the first year, the war still feels distant enough that learning to fly feels like the fulfillment of a childhood wish rather than preparation for anything terrible. You train first on gliders, then on slow biplanes, and finally on faster aircraft, developing the particular, private joy of a person discovering that the thing they always suspected about themselves, that the sky belonged to them somehow, turns out to be true. Your closest friend at the training base is Hiroshi, a fisherman's son from a neighboring prefecture who laughs at almost everything and flies with a natural ease that makes veteran instructors take notice. Your primary instructor, Lieutenant Nakamura, is a quiet man in his 30s who flew reconnaissance missions early in the war and carries himself with the particular stillness of someone who has already seen enough of it to stop pretending flying is only about joy. He pushes you harder than he pushes the other cadets, and you do not understand why until much later. There are quieter moments during this first year that you will carry with you long after everything else about the war has changed shape in your memory. Sunday afternoons when Hiroshi convinces half the barracks to trade rations for extra rice. Evenings spent repairing a borrowed radio that catches almost nothing but static and the occasional distant broadcast. Letters from Yuki describing her town's harvest festival in enough careful detail that you can nearly smell the roasted chestnuts from hundreds of kilometers away. The war exists during this period, mostly as rumor and newspaper headline, something happening to other men in other places, and you allow yourself cautiously to imagine a future where flying remains simply the joyful, private thing it was always meant to be. By early 1945, the war has turned catastrophically against Japan, and the training base you once considered a place of childhood dreams fulfilled becomes something else entirely. American forces have taken island after island across the Pacific, drawing steadily closer to the home islands themselves, and the losses at sea have grown severe enough that conventional naval aviation can no longer meaningfully contest American fleets. It is in this atmosphere, one of shrinking options and mounting desperation, that officers begin visiting training bases to describe a new kind of unit, the Special Attack Corps, aircraft loaded with explosives and flown directly into enemy ships, a tactic framed to exhausted, frightened young men, as the one remaining way an individual pilot might meaningfully affect the outcome of an unwinnable war. Volunteering is presented as exactly that, a choice, though every cadet in the room understands the specific weight beneath a superior officer's expectant silence after asking who among you is willing. Hiroshi volunteers first, his hand raised before you fully process what is being asked. You raise yours a moment later, less from conviction than from the particular, suffocating pressure of watching your closest friend commit to something you cannot let him face without you standing beside him. Nakamura does not volunteer his opinion of the program openly, not where officers might hear, but the night after your unit's names are confirmed for the Special Attack Corps. He finds you alone near the airfield's edge and speaks more plainly than you have ever heard him speak. He tells you that a warrior's duty and a nation's desperation are not always the same thing wearing the same uniform, and that you should understand precisely what you have agreed to rather than let ceremony and speeches obscure it from you. You ask him whether he believes it will change anything, whether ships will truly be stopped by pilots willing to die reaching them. He looks at you for a long moment and says only that some questions a soldier is not permitted to answer honestly out loud, though he trusts you already know his answer regardless. It is the closest thing to fatherly protection the war allows him to offer you, and you carry it more carefully than any official briefing you receive afterward. Training intensifies at an airbase in Chiran, on the southern tip of Kyushu, a place that becomes, in the final months of the war, one of the primary departure points for missions flown against the American fleet supporting the invasion of Okinawa. The atmosphere at Chiran carries a strange, unbearable duality, equal parts military ceremony and something closer to a village saying goodbye to its own children. Local women, organized informally, prepare meals for departing pilots and help sew senenbari, 1,000-stitch belts believed to offer protection, each stitch contributed by a different woman passing the fabric hand to hand. Yuki, a girl from a neighboring town who writes to you throughout your training and whom you have quietly hoped, in another life entirely, you might have eventually married, contributes several stitches to the belt you are given before your assigned mission date, though neither of you speaks aloud about what the belt is actually meant to protect you from, or from what it almost certainly cannot. In the evenings, pilots gather at a small tea house near the base, run by a woman the departing men have come to call, affectionately, something close to a second mother, and she keeps a photograph album of every young man who has eaten at her tables before departing, adding new pages weekly with a steady, quiet grief she never allows to show fully on her face while any of you are present. Hiroshi teaches the youngest cadets card games late into the night, less because he particularly loves cards and more, you suspect, because it fills hours that might otherwise be spent thinking too clearly about what waits at the end of them. The days before your assigned missions stretch into a strange, suspended kind of waiting, filled with letters written to family members in careful, formal language designed to comfort rather than frighten, though every pilot understands the letter's function, in practice, as a final goodbye dressed in gentler words. You write to your mother that you are proud, that you go without fear, and though parts of this are performance for her benefit, parts of it are also disturbingly true. The specific way a person can hold both genuine conviction and genuine terror in the same chest without either canceling the other out. Hiroshi, 2 days before his own assigned departure, laughs less than usual and asks you quietly whether you think it will hurt. And you tell him you do not know, because you genuinely do not. And because false comfort feels, in this specific moment, like the one thing you refuse to offer him. Hiroshi's mission departs on a clear morning in May 1945. You watch his aircraft become a small shape against open water before it disappears entirely from view, and no confirmation ever reaches the base regarding what became of it. Only silence, which every pilot who remains understands to be its own kind of answer. Your own assigned mission arrives 12 days later, targeting the American naval forces still concentrated around Okinawa. You wake before dawn, eat a small ceremonial meal alongside other departing pilots, and receive the senenbari belt from an officer who recites the names of the women who sewed it, Yuki's name among them, though you do not see her in person before takeoff. You climb into the cockpit of an aircraft carrying far more explosive weight than it was ever originally designed to carry, and you take off into a gray morning sky that for one disorienting moment still somehow resembles the ordinary mornings you once flew through purely for the joy of it. You fly south toward Okinawa in formation with several other aircraft, engines straining under the additional weight, and for the better part of an hour, The mission proceeds according to the terrible, simple logic it was designed around. Then your engine begins losing power, a rough, uneven shudder traveling through the airframe that you recognize immediately as mechanical failure rather than enemy fire. Since no American aircraft or ship has yet come within visible range, you attempt every correction Nakamura ever taught you, adjusting fuel mixture, checking instruments, coaxing the engine toward stability. But the aircraft continues losing altitude regardless, the ocean below rising steadily closer with every passing minute. You radio your formation, informing them of mechanical failure, and receive brief acknowledgement before they continue onward without you. The mission's underlying logic permitting no possibility of turning back regardless of circumstance. Alone now, losing altitude over open water roughly 40 kilometers from the Okinawan coast, you face a strange, unscripted decision that your training never fully prepared you for. Since the entire program was built around the assumption that a pilot's only remaining choice, once airborne, was how bravely he approached an ending already decided in advance. You ditch the aircraft into the sea as gently as damaged controls allow, the impact violent enough to leave you disoriented and bleeding from a cut above your eyebrow, though the aircraft remains afloat long enough for you to escape the cockpit before it finally sinks beneath the waves, taking with it an explosive payload that will now never reach any target at all. You float in open water for several hours, the Senenbari belt still tied around your waist beneath your flight suit, uncertain whether rescue or death will arrive first, and uncertain, in the strange clarity that exhaustion eventually produces, which outcome you are even hoping for anymore. A Japanese patrol boat locates you shortly before nightfall, pulling you from the water half-conscious, and the sailors aboard regard you with an expression you cannot immediately identify, somewhere between relief and something closer to confusion, as though your survival itself represents a category of outcome nobody aboard fully knows how to respond to. You are returned to a naval hospital on Kyushu, physically recovering within weeks, though the specific nature of your survival, a pilot whose mission failed through mechanical accident rather than enemy action, places you in an uncomfortable, undefined position within a program built entirely around missions that were never meant to produce survivors. Officers debate, in conversations you are not meant to overhear, whether you should be reassigned to a new mission once medically cleared. And for a period of several weeks, you exist in a strange, suspended state, neither honored as a survivor nor fully processed as a failure, simply waiting to learn which version of your remaining life the war still intends to claim. Nakamura visits you once during your recovery, saying very little, though he leaves the small bamboo kite your sister packed for you, recovered from your quarters at Chiran, resting on the table beside your hospital bed without comment. An acknowledgement neither of you needs to put into words. During the weeks of recovery, you find yourself unable to fully explain, even to the nurses who tend your wounds with careful, professional kindness, the particular strangeness of healing from injuries sustained while surviving a mission specifically designed to make survival impossible. Other patients in the ward, wounded through more conventional means, occasionally ask what happened to your aircraft, and you learn to give shorter and shorter versions of the answer each time, until eventually, you simply say engine trouble and let the listener draw whatever conclusion feels most comfortable to them. Japan surrenders in August 1945 before your medical clearance is finalized, and the program that shaped the entire trajectory of your final 2 years simply ceases to exist within the span of a single radio broadcast, leaving you and hundreds of other partially trained or medically delayed pilots suspended in a strange, unresolved category the war's sudden ending never quite explains to anyone's satisfaction. You return to your village along the Kagoshima coast in the autumn of 1945, uncertain how to answer neighbors who ask, carefully, whether you completed your mission, since the honest answer, That mechanical failure rather than any change of heart determined your survival. Feels both too complicated and too private to offer casually on a village street. Your father meets you at the harbor without asking anything at all, simply gripping your shoulder the way he once gripped a fishing line pulled taut against something larger than expected. Your mother holds you for a long time, saying nothing about the tears she once claimed were only the wind. Yuki, who lost her own brother in a separate mission that same terrible spring, visits you within the first week, and neither of you fully knows what to say to each other. Two people whose lives the war shaped in mirror opposite directions, one surviving through failure, one grieving through completion. You do not speak publicly about the Special Attack Corps for many years. In a country working to understand its own recent history through a confusing mixture of silence, shame, and selective memory. When your own children eventually ask what you did during the war, you tell them, honestly, that you were trained to give your life for a cause that ultimately asked children barely older than they are now to fly aircraft into ships, and that you survived only because an engine failed at exactly the correct moment rather than through any particular courage or wisdom of your own. You tell them about Hiroshi, whose laughter you still remember more vividly than his final flight, and about Nakamura, who tried within the narrow space the military allowed him to protect you from believing the program's own propaganda completely. You keep your father's small bamboo kite for the rest of your life, and on clear afternoons, well into old age, you occasionally walk to the same breakwater where you once watched gulls as a boy, flying it briefly before folding it carefully away again. A private ritual whose full meaning you never fully explain to anyone, including yourself. You are 81 when your granddaughter finds the Senenbari belt, still faintly stained with seawater, folded inside an old wooden box alongside the kite. She is studying the war at school that term, and her teacher has assigned students to interview a family elder who lived through it. An assignment she approaches with the particular seriousness only a 14-year-old preparing her first real research project can manage. She asks what it is. You tell her it was meant to protect a young man who no longer entirely recognizes himself in old photographs from that spring. A belt sewn by women, including one you once loved, for a mission that ended not in the sky above a distant harbor, but in open water through failure rather than fate. She asks whether you consider yourself lucky. You tell her that luck feels like the wrong word for surviving something built specifically to ensure you would not. That the correct word, if one exists at all, is simply spared, and that being spared carries its own particular weight that luck never quite has to carry. You hand her the small bamboo kite, its paint faded now to something closer to the color of an old, clear sky, and you tell her that your hands were always built to love flight rather than to end anything, and that it took the specific, terrible accident of a failing engine, 40 kilometers above open water, to finally return your hands to the purpose they were always meant to serve.